Everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. We all love learning new things, right? But sometimes it feels like we're just scratching the surface.
Absolutely.
Like we're getting the basics, but how do we really push past that? How do we reach our full potential in whatever we're trying to learn? Well, that's exactly what we're diving into today.
Oh, good.
We're going to be looking at this really cool research article from 2017. It's called Achieving Optimal Best: Instructional Efficiency and the Use of Cognitive Load Theory in Mathematical Problem Solving.
Yeah.
It's by Fan, Mungu, and Young. And our mission, if you choose to accept it, is to uncover the secrets to maximizing our learning. And get this, a huge part of it has to do with how we're taught, how the information is presented to us.
That's right.
So buckle up because we're about to unlock some serious learning power.
I'm excited. This research introduces something called the Framework of Achievement Bests, and it's all about understanding how individuals can hit their absolute peak performance when it comes to learning.
Optimal achievement best. It sounds pretty ambitious.
It is. And they contrast it with what they call realistic achievement best. It's kind of like, think about it this way. Your realistic best is like, you're cruising along, getting things done, but not really pushing yourself too hard. You're functioning okay, but maybe not tapping into your full potential.
Right, like coasting.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But moving from that realistic best to your optimal best, that's where the magic happens. That's what they call the process of optimization.
Okay, so there's this whole process involved.
Yeah, and the researchers, they connect this directly to student motivation, particularly in subjects like math. They also talk about how instructional design, how teaching is structured, and this thing called cognitive load theory. Those are huge factors in reaching that optimal best.
So let me ask you this. Why is it so important to even aim for this optimal best? What do we actually gain by pushing ourselves that extra mile?
Well, on a personal level, it means you're not just going through the motions. Especially when it comes to something like math, it's not just about getting the right answer.
Right.
It shows a deeper level of understanding. You have this inner drive, this real desire to excel.
Yeah, it's about going beyond just knowing the steps.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But here's the really cool part. The research suggests that when people are empowered to reach their optimal best, it doesn't just benefit them as individuals.
It has a ripple effect.
Exactly. It actually contributes to the overall progress and well-being of society as a whole. It's like a positive model for personal growth and how we think.
That's a really interesting perspective. So what are the key things that can turn us into these optimizers, the people who are always striving for that optimal best?
That's a great question. The research looks at a few different theories that try to explain this,
Okay.
like self-efficacy, believing in your own abilities. There's also the concept of flow, that feeling of being totally absorbed in the task. And of course, there's cognitive load, which we'll unpack in more detail later.
Cognitive load, yeah, that's a big one.
It is. But for our deep dive today, we're really focusing on how effective teaching methods, especially in math, can act as optimizers.
So the way we're taught actually helps us reach our full potential.
That's the idea. The article looks specifically at whether certain ways of teaching, like using algebra, can really boost our ability to achieve that optimal level.
Earlier, you mentioned an example about solving equations. Could we go back to that to really highlight the difference between realistic best and optimal best?
Of course. Imagine someone functioning at their realistic best, right? And they're given two equations. One is like 5% of x equals 30, and the other one is something like 2x equals 6. Now, they might automatically assume that the first one with the percentages is way harder.
Yeah, percentages can be tricky.
Right. But someone operating at their optimal best, they'd be able to see past that initial reaction. They'd recognize that both equations, at their core, require the same type of algebraic thinking to solve for x.
So it's about seeing the underlying structure, not getting hung up on the surface details.
Exactly. And this is where good teaching comes in. Suboptimal teaching might focus on those surface-level differences. It makes things seem more complex than they really are.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, the article uses a specific example about buying a tennis racket to really illustrate this idea. Can you walk us through that?
Absolutely. So the problem is I spent 8% of my money on a tennis racket that cost $108. How much money did I have before buying the racket? And they introduced two fictional students,
Okay.
Melissa and Hugh. Now, Melissa, she's operating at her realistic best. She can solve different types of percentage problems, like finding a part of a whole, finding the percentage, or finding the whole amount. But because her instruction might not have connected those concepts effectively, she struggles. She's stuck in this mindset that finding the part is easy, finding the percent is a bit harder, and finding the whole amount is the most difficult.
So she's competent, but she's not seeing the bigger picture.
Right. Now, Hugh, on the other hand, has had instruction that focuses on minimizing cognitive load. He understands those underlying structures of percentage problems so well that he doesn't see the find whole problem as any harder than the other types. In fact, he can even solve problems that combine elements of finding the part, percent, and whole. We call those transfer problems. And he's not just solving them, he's actively looking for different ways to do it. He's demonstrating what we call a seeking of mastery.
So it's not just about getting the right answer, it's about wanting to understand it deeply.
Precisely. And that's a hallmark of optimal best. Melissa's realistic best doesn't reflect her true ability. She might even have the motivation, but just hasn't been taught effectively. But Hugh's optimal best, that shows both competence and a real desire to go beyond the surface.
That's a really powerful distinction. The article then introduces the idea of a zone of optimization. What exactly is that?
Think of it as the space between your realistic best and your optimal best. It's the potential waiting to be unlocked. They connect this to the concept of human optimization, which is all about the motivational and social factors that help us actually reach that optimal level in our learning.
So it's not just about raw talent, it's about the right environment and internal drive.
Right, it's a combination of things.
Okay. Now, there's also a process of optimization that the article lays out. Can you walk us through that?
Of course. So this process starts with things called optimizing agents. These are the catalysts that kickstart our movement toward that optimal best.
What are some examples of these agents?
Well, they can be psychological, like self-efficacy, that's believing in your ability,
Right.
or having sense of hope and optimism. They can also be educational practices, and this is where good teaching comes in. Effective instructional design is a big one. And then there are psychosocial factors, things like a supportive home environment.
So it's a mix of internal and external factors.
Exactly. And all of these optimizing agents, they trigger internal personal processes within us,
Like what?
like persistence, the ability to stick with it when things get tough,
Yeah.
putting in consistent effort,
That's important.
and something they call effective functioning, which is basically using your cognitive resources efficiently and strategically.
Okay.
And here's the key. The researchers really emphasize that effective instructional designs, those that keep cognitive load at a healthy level, those are like super important optimizing agents. Because think about it, if the way we're taught is confusing or overwhelming, that high cognitive load can actually prevent us from ever moving past our realistic best. That's like hitting a wall. But the great thing is our realistic best, it's not fixed.
It can change.
Exactly. It can be elevated through these positive optimizing agents.
Okay, so good teaching can actually raise our baseline level of ability. That's pretty powerful. Now, the article then shifts its focus to instructional efficiency for mathematics learning. How does this idea of cognitive load play into making learning more efficient?
This is where things get really interesting. They argue that truly effective learning, where we achieve that deep understanding, it's all about having the right pedagogical approaches, the right teaching methods.
Right.
And these methods need to do two things. One, they need to make the subject matter engaging.
We've got to be interested.
Exactly. But they also need to ensure that the teaching itself is efficient. That means helping you reach understanding with the least amount of unnecessary mental strain. They bring back the find whole percentage problem and they pose this question.
Okay.
How can someone learn to solve this type of problem effectively without all the mental gymnastics through teaching that really understands and works with our cognitive capacity?
So it's not just about teaching the right stuff, it's about teaching it the right way.
Exactly. And their core argument here is that effective learning happens when there's an inverse relationship between the teaching approach and the cognitive load it places on the learner.
Okay. Can you explain that a bit more?
So basically, a good teaching approach, one that's really efficient, leads to strong understanding without overloading the learner's mental resources.
It's like finding the sweet spot.
Exactly.
Now, you mentioned earlier this idea of measuring cognitive load.
Yeah,
It seems like something that happens inside our heads. How do we actually quantify it?
that's the tricky part, because it is internal. In the early days, researchers often relied on subjective reports. They'd just ask learners, hey, how much mental effort did you feel you put in?
Okay.
But of course, there are limitations to that approach.
It's subjective.
Right. So more recently, they've been developing more sophisticated tools that try to differentiate between different types of cognitive load.
There are different types.
Yeah, there's extraneous load, which is like the bad guy. It actually hinders learning.
We don't want that.
Nope. Then there's intrinsic load, which is inherent to the material itself.
Okay.
And then there's your main load. This is the mental effort that actually helps us learn and build those mental frameworks that we need to understand things.
So it's the effort that actually pays off.
Precisely. And the article introduces this concept of instructional efficiency, which they actually have an equation for.
An equation. Okay, I'm intrigued.
Yeah, it's E equals, and I won't get too technical here, but basically it's performance minus mental effort, all divided by the square root of 2.
Okay.
And both performance and mental effort are converted to standardized scores. And basically, a higher E value means the teaching method is more efficient. They then suggest using this equation to compare the efficiency of different teaching approaches, specifically for solving percentage problems.
Okay, so they're putting these different teaching methods to the test. What kind of approaches are they comparing?
They're looking at 4 main approaches: unitary, unitary pictorial, equation, and equation pictorial. And they want to see how these approaches perform when students are solving simple, familiar percentage problems, and also when they're tackling more complex transfer problems.
Right.
Those are the ones that really test a deeper level of understanding.
Okay, so what were their predictions about which teaching methods would be most efficient, both for someone at their realistic best and someone striving for their optimal best?
Well, for the simple percentage problems, those that someone at their realistic best could probably handle, they didn't expect to see huge differences in efficiency between the 4 methods.
Okay, that makes sense.
But for the more challenging transfer problems, the ones that really show you're moving toward optimal best, they predicted that the equation-based approaches, so that's the pure equation method and the equation pictorial method, would be significantly more efficient.
Interesting. So algebra might be the key to unlocking that optimal best in more complex situations.
That's what they're hypothesizing.
Okay, let's dive into cognitive load theory itself. What are the key principles that we need to understand?
Cognitive load theory is a framework for educators.
Okay.
It helps them design instruction that helps learners build mental models, what we call schemas. Schemas are like these mental blueprints for solving problems or understanding concepts. And one of the most important concepts is element interactivity.
Element interactivity, okay.
It refers to how many different pieces of information we have to process at the same time to make sense of something.
So the more elements interacting, the more complex the task.
Exactly. If there are many elements that are really interconnected and they need to be processed simultaneously, then the task has high element interactivity.
Right.
And this is what drives the 3 types of cognitive load that we talked about. Intrinsic load, which comes from the material itself; extraneous load, which comes from bad teaching; and germane load, which is the effort we put in that leads to actual learning.
Can you give us a clear example of what low versus high intrinsic cognitive load looks like and how this element interactivity comes into play?
Sure. Think about recognizing the numeral 7
Okay.
that has really low intrinsic cognitive load and almost no element interactivity. We learn to identify a 7 without needing to think about other numbers or complex relationships.
Right.
Now, contrast that with our tennis racket problem. That has a much higher intrinsic cognitive load. To solve it, you need to simultaneously process the 8%, the idea that my money is the whole amount, and the $108 as part of that whole.
Okay.
And then you need to understand the relationship between them, which could involve an equation like 0.08 times x equals $108. Each piece of that equation can't be fully understood on its own. They're interconnected. And that interconnectedness is what creates that higher intrinsic load.
Right, because they all depend on each other. It's not just isolated pieces of information.
Exactly.
The article mentions a previous study that found the equation approach to be more effective in a certain context. What was the reasoning behind that finding?
So that research was done by Ngu and colleagues in 2014, and they suggested that the equation-based approach worked better because it reduced the need to process so many interacting elements at the same time, compared to other methods that might be more visual or step-by-step. They also found that certain techniques within algebra might be even better. For instance, solving equations using the inverse operation could be easier than just relying on the balance method.
Interesting. So it's not just about using algebra, it's about using it in the most efficient way possible.
Precisely.
Now, the article goes into a lot of detail about 4 different ways to teach percentage problems and analyzes the element interactivity of each method using our tennis racket example.
Yeah.
Let's break them down one by one.
Sure.
Starting with the unitary approach.
Okay, so the unitary approach is all about finding the value of one unit. Usually that's 1%.
Okay.
So in our tennis racket problem, where we know that 108 Taylors represents 8%, we'd first figure out what 1% is. That means dividing 108 Taylors by 8. And then we'd multiply that by 100 to find the whole amount.
Right, so it's breaking it down into smaller steps.
Right. But each of those steps, they argue, involves managing multiple pieces of information. For example, to even figure out what 1% is, you need to link the 8%, the unknown total amount, and the 108 dailers all together. And trying to calculate 1% without a clear visual reference can be really abstract.
It's hard to picture what 1% actually represents.
Exactly. So you're constantly having to hold these separate bits of information in your mind and connect them.
That's a lot of mental juggling.
It is.
Yeah.
And all that juggling, that's what creates extraneous cognitive load. So they suggest that the unitary approach, it probably has a high intrinsic load because of the multiple steps involved, but it also has a high extraneous load because you're constantly having to integrate information.
So it's potentially not the most efficient way to learn.
Not necessarily, no.
Okay, next up is the unitary pictorial approach. How does adding a visual element change the cognitive demands here?
So this approach follows the same basic steps as the unitary method. Find 1%, then scale to 100%.
Okay.
But the key difference is that it uses a visual aid, usually a bar diagram.
So for the tennis racket problem, we might see a bar that represents the total amount of money with 8% shaded in and labeled as $108. Is that right?
Exactly. And the idea is that this visual representation, it increases what we call germane cognitive load, which is a good thing.
Germane load is the helpful kind, right?
Exactly.
Because it helps us make connections.
Right. And it helps you visualize that proportional relationship. The diagram helps align the $108 with that 8%, and it shows the whole as 100%.
Okay.
And this is important because it reduces something called the split attention effect.
Split attention effect, what's that?
That's the mental effort of trying to integrate information that's presented separately as text and image.
Oh, right, like when you have to keep jumping back and forth between a diagram and the written explanation?
Exactly. So by bringing everything together visually, you're reducing that split attention effect, which makes things easier to process.
That makes sense.
And this alignment helps you build a mental model based on proportional reasoning. And it gives you a more concrete reference for what that 1% actually represents. Because of all these visual cues, the unitary pictorial approach is thought to have lower element interactivity compared to the pure unitary method.
So the visual really helps bridge the gaps and reduce that mental strain.
It does.
Now, what about the equation approach? How does using algebra, actually setting up an equation, affect element interactivity?
So the equation approach, as we mentioned before, is all about taking the word problem and turning it into a math equation.
Right.
For the tennis racket problem, it would be something like 0.08 times x equals 108, where x represents the total amount of money. The process involves figuring out what you don't know, setting up the equation based on what the problem tells you, and then using algebra to solve for x.
Okay.
And while the concept of a variable might be tricky for some people, the researchers argue that the equation approach actually has lower element interactivity overall compared to the unitary methods. And the reason is that the equation itself acts as this concise way to show all the key information, the 8%, the $108, and the unknown total in a single symbolic form.
So it's like packing everything neatly into one package.
Exactly. It shows the relationship between those elements very clearly.
Okay, that makes sense. And finally, we have the equation pictorial approach. This is where we combine algebra with a visual representation. How does that stack up in terms of cognitive load?
So this approach takes a diagram, like the one we use for the unitary pictorial method, and then adds the equation.
Okay.
The equation usually comes straight from the diagram, something like x over 100 equals 108 over 8. And while the steps to solve it and the overall element interactivity are similar to the pure equation approach, there's a slight twist.
What's that?
The equation ends up with fractions, like 108 over 8, which some people might find a bit harder to work with.
Okay.
But even with that, the researchers suggest that this equation pictorial approach often leads to lower cognitive load overall.
Interesting. Why is that?
Well, the visual part reinforces the proportional relationship, which can tap into a more intuitive understanding.
Okay.
So it might reduce that intrinsic load associated with just manipulating symbols.
So the picture helps ground the abstract equation.
Exactly. And the act of processing that diagram and connecting it to the equation can actually increase germane load, which, again, is a good thing.
Because it encourages deeper processing.
Exactly.
It's fascinating how these different teaching choices can have such different impacts on our cognitive resources, even when they're aiming for the same outcome. Now, the article emphasizes that their analysis of element interactivity isn't just about counting the number of things being presented.
That's right.
There's more to it than that. Can
Yeah.
you elaborate on what they mean?
Absolutely. They're looking at the nature of the math concepts themselves
Okay.
and the complexity of the relationships between those concepts. So, for example, with the equation approach, it's one thing to just identify the 8%, the $108, and the x, but the real learning comes from understanding the relationship that equation represents.
How those elements connect to each other.
Exactly. And that deeper understanding of the interconnectedness, that's what algebra really helped us with. It distinguishes it from those methods that rely more on just memorizing steps.
Right. It's about understanding the why, not just the how.
Exactly. And this more nuanced view of element interactivity gives us some really valuable insights into why certain methods, like algebra, can be so powerful for problem solving.
It's not just about manipulating symbols, it's about grasping the underlying structure.
Exactly.
Based on this analysis, the researchers propose a specific order for both the level of element interactivity and the expected instructional efficiency of these four approaches. What are those hypothesized orders?
Okay, so for element interactivity, they hypothesized that the unitary approach would have the highest level, followed by the unitary pictorial, then the equation approach, and finally the equation pictorial approach with the lowest.
Okay, so equation pictorial is the most streamlined in terms of cognitive demands.
That's what they're predicting. And because of that, they hypothesized the reverse order for instructional efficiency,
Winning.
meaning the equation pictorial would be the most efficient, followed by the pure equation approach,
Yeah.
then unitary pictorial, and lastly, the unitary approach would be the least efficient.
Okay, so the easier something is to process, the more efficiently we can learn it.
Precisely. But it's important to remember, these are just hypotheses. They need to be tested through actual research.
Right.
And in reality, the best way to learn likely involves a combination of these approaches.
Of course, everyone learns differently.
Absolutely.
Now let's talk about achieving that optimal best for percentage problems. How do these different approaches actually impact our ability to really master all the different types of percentage problems?
So the focus here shifts from just solving one type of percentage problem to achieving this broader mastery across all three main types. Finding the part, finding the percent, and finding the whole. They're asking, are the equation-based approaches truly more effective in helping students achieve that deep, comprehensive understanding?
Right, so it's not just about being good at one specific type of problem.
Exactly. And they show how our tennis racket problem can be transformed into each of those three types. And then they show what the equations would look like for both the equation and equation pictorial methods.
Okay.
And the really cool thing about algebra, they argue, is its ability to represent that core relationship between the part, the percent, and the whole in a consistent equation format.
So it provides a unified structure regardless of what you're solving for.
Exactly. And where the unknown variable x sits in that equation, that tells you which element you're trying to find.
Okay.
And from a cognitive load perspective, where that x is doesn't fundamentally change the complexity of the equation.
So all three types of problems essentially become equally easy to process.
That's the idea. And that's what allows learners to see these three problem types as structurally the same, which reduces the cognitive load associated with learning them as separate procedures.
So instead of seeing them as three different things, you see them as variations on the same theme.
Exactly. And that unified understanding, it empowers you to solve those individual types, but it also makes you better at tackling those more complex problems that combine different elements.
Those transfer problems.
Right. And they conclude that the equation pictorial and equation approaches probably lead to a lower overall cognitive load when learning all three types of percentage problems.
Because they're more efficient.
Exactly. And they even propose that this pursuit of mastery that comes with that algebraic understanding might actually encourage learners to explore other strategies.
Oh, interesting. So they might try the unitary pictorial approach or something else?
Exactly. Once they've got that deep conceptual understanding, they can be more flexible.
Okay. So the algebraic methods seem to be more efficient and better at helping students reach that optimal best. How does this compare to the unitary approach?
Well, they argue that the unitary approach often leads people to treat each type of percentage problem as a separate thing, requiring different sets of steps.
So you're memorizing procedures instead of understanding the underlying concept,
Right, and this can create this perceived hierarchy of difficulty.
where finding the part is the easiest and finding the whole is the hardest.
Exactly. And the unitary method, it doesn't always explicitly highlight the underlying concept that connects these problem types. And that might be why so many students struggle to see the relationship between them.
Right. They're just saying a bunch of different procedures.
Right. So going back to Melissa, She might be really good at finding the part, but struggle with finding the whole.
Because she hasn't been taught in a way that helps her connect the dots.
Exactly. And the unitary pictorial approach, it helps a bit by providing that visual anchor that shows the relationship.
Right.
And it does have lower element interactivity than the pure unitary method. So it can be a useful stepping stone.
Okay.
But ultimately, they argue that reaching optimal best is about pedagogical choices that carefully consider cognitive load and promote understanding of those underlying structures.
Which the algebraic approaches do more effectively?
Precisely.
Okay, so the way we're taught the instructional design, it really matters. Now, the article touches on the cognitive and affective dimensions of learning.
Yes.
So this brings in things like motivation and emotions. How do those fit into this whole picture of optimal best and cognitive load?
That's a great point. While we've been focusing a lot on the cognitive stuff, the mechanics of how we process information, the researchers are very clear that our feelings, our motivation to learn, those play a huge role.
Right, because you can have the best teaching in the world, but if you're not motivated, it's not going to stick.
Exactly. And some research has looked at how certain learning activities, like getting students to explain things in their own words, can actually increase germane load.
Which is the good kind.
Right, because it leads to deeper understanding. But the argument is that unless students are motivated to put in that extra mental effort, it might not be as effective.
So there's this complex interplay between cognitive load and motivation.
There is. And the research on the direct link between germane load and motivation, it's still ongoing.
Okay.
But the realistic best and optimal best framework tries to address this by suggesting that how information is presented, specifically the level of element interactivity, can impact a student's motivation and their willingness to invest effort.
So it's about making the learning process both manageable and engaging.
Precisely. And ultimately, the goal is to understand how all these cognitive processes, our emotions and our motivation, how they work together in learning, whether it's math or anything else.
Right, because it's all connected.
Right.
Now, the article wraps up the main discussion with a section that brings together achievement bests, instructional approaches, and cognitive load.
Yes.
What are the key takeaways from this synthesis?
Well, they point out that there's actually not a ton of research that directly looks at the relationship between a student's motivation and the cognitive load they experience while learning.
Okay.
And they suggest that the framework of achievement bests, it offers a really good starting point for exploring that connection. They highlight that the goal is to empower individuals to reach their optimal best.
Right.
And they describe the learning process as this kind of sequence. The instructional approach we encounter influences our internal processes, like how persistent we are, how much effort we put in,
Okay.
and that in turn leads to our level of achievement.
Ideally reaching that optimal best.
Exactly. And they talk about some of their ongoing research that's designed to validate this framework, specifically in math learning. They're looking at the impact of different teaching methods, the cognitive load they impose, those internal processes, and ultimately student achievement and competence.
So they're putting this framework to the test in the real world.
They are. And they want to understand how good instruction helps us reach optimal best and how high cognitive load actually hinders it. They've even developed these questionnaires that try to measure realistic achievement best, optimal achievement best levels in individuals.
Oh, wow. So they're trying to quantify these concepts.
They are. And they're working to make sure those measures are reliable and valid. And this research is important because it connects this framework to actual teaching practices and the idea of cognitive efficiency.